He invited the maid to play chess as a joke. 5 moves later, no one was laughing. Have you ever seen a man so rich he forgets what it means to be decent? That was Richard Vance, CEO of Zenith Dynamics. The man had built an empire off cutting-edge technology and global logistics, but forgot how to look people in the eye, unless they were holding a yacht club membership or wearing a bespoke suit. It was the first weekend of December, just outside of Sedona, Arizona, the annual executive retreat. The kind of gathering where people in tailored jackets pretend to enjoy fireside chats and team-building exercises while their minds are on stock options and hostile takeovers. Richard didn't do casual. Even his relaxed weekends were performances, an excuse to flaunt his wealth and remind everyone who the alpha was. This year, he rented out a sprawling 5-acre estate with 9 bedrooms, a private theater, and a chessboard, carved from ebony and ivory that sat dead center in the grand hall like a sacred artifact. The guest top executives, their spouses, a few venture capitalists from New York arrived Friday night. The catering staff was flown in from Miami. The servers wore tuxedos. The maids, quiet, uniformed, invisible. Or at least that's how Richard saw them. Elara M. Hayes had been hired last minute through an exclusive staffing agency. 55 years old, soft-spoken, steady. She moved through the house like clockwork, folding towels and clearing dishes without a sound. Nobody asked her name. Nobody looked her in the eye, except for one woman, Sarah Jenkins, VP of Innovation, who complimented Elara's efficiency and offered a genuine smile when she passed by with appetizers. But even that felt more like professional courtesy than anything. Real. By Saturday evening, the crowd had loosened up. Fine whiskey poured into crystal glasses. Laughter grew louder. Richard stood in the middle of the living room with a tumbler of single malt and that signature smirk on his face. The conversation had shifted to strategy games and leadership. Business is like chess, he declared. Every move should make the other person sweat. People nodded, chuckled. Of course they did. Richard walked over to the chessboard, spinning one of the knights between his fingers. Anyone want to try their luck? He asked, eyes sweeping the room like a hawk scanning its prey. No one moved. He turned then, just enough to catch Elara crossing through the hall with a tray of clean champagne. Flutes. You, he said, loud enough to cut through every conversation. Elara froze mid-step. Richard grinned. You ever play chess? She paused, looked at him, then at the board. A little, she said quietly. Oh, come on now, he chuckled. Don't be shy. Let's see what the help can do. A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the room. Someone coughed. Sarah Jenkins's face twitched, unsure if she should laugh or leave. Elara looked at the guests, then back at Richard, her lips pressed together. In a firm line. She walked over, gently set the tray down on a side table, and wiped her hands on her apron. Sure, she said, her voice steady. If you want to play, I'll play. Richard clapped his hands like a game show host. That's the spirit. He yanked out the chair across from him and gestured with an exaggerated bow. The guests circled him like vultures. One guy even pulled out his phone to record. Richard moved first, aggressive, fast, like he was swatting flies instead of playing chess. Elara didn't rush. She sat back in the chair, eyes focused, hands folded under the table like she had all the time in the world. The laughter quieted. Something in her stillness made people stop smiling. But what no one in that room knew was this. Elara Hayes had played this game before, and not just on a board. She'd played it with her life. Elara didn't dress like someone you'd expect to see at a chessboard. Her heather gray tunic was tucked neatly into practical black trousers, And her shoes were the kind meant for long shifts, not compliments. Her silver-streaked hair was pinned back simply, but her eyes, sharp, clear, watchful, didn't miss a thing. Richard leaned forward across the board, cracking his knuckles. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll go easy." Alara smiled faintly. "Please don't." The guests chuckled, some awkwardly, some genuinely. No one knew if she was joking. Richard didn't like that. He opened with an aggressive king's pawn, predictable, showy. Alara responded with a quiet defense. Bishop's pawn, slow and calculated. Then she waited, not nervously, but patiently, like someone who knew the weight of silence stopped by the third move. Richard was narrating. "This is called the Italian game. Old school, classic. They teach it in beginner books." Alara didn't say anything. She just moved her knight, and suddenly the angle shifted. People leaned in closer. Sarah whispered to her husband, "She's not guessing. Look at her. She's studying him." Richard, maybe sensing the shift in energy, cleared his throat and glanced at the crowd. "You know, I once beat a hedge fund manager. In 6 moves. Guy never saw it coming." Alara slid her bishop diagonally across the board. A clean, quiet move. "You sure you haven't played before?" Richard asked, eyes narrowing. "I played a little in college," she said. "Oh yeah, where?" "Morehouse," she replied. That gave a few people pause. Morehouse College, a historically black college, well known for its rigorous academics. "You studied there?" Richard asked, now trying to sound casual. "I did," Alara said. "Computer science, full ride." Somewhere in the back, someone muttered. "Damn," Richard blinked. He looked at the board, then at her. "And now you clean houses?" he asked. Alara didn't flinch. "My mother got sick. I left before graduation to take care of her. Never went back." She moved her knight again. Another solid play. Not flashy, not loud, but it cut off Richard's entire left side. For a second, the room was quiet. He scratched his chin, suddenly unsure of the next move. Ilara's voice was calm. "You don't have to do something forever for it to matter." Richard stared at her. She wasn't being smug. She wasn't performing. She was just telling the truth. For the first time all weekend, nobody in the room said a word. It was like watching something shift in slow motion, one piece at a time. He moved. His queen aggressively, trying to reclaim space, but she parried with ease. Moved the pawn. Simple. Precise. "You trap yourself when you don't respect the board," she said quietly. That hit different. Richard leaned back in his chair, laughing nervously. "You're quoting Sun Tzu now." Alara looked up, her face unreadable. "No, my uncle taught me that. He worked at a tire shop in Memphis, played chess on milk crates outside the shop during his breaks." There was weight in that statement, more than Richard knew how to carry. He looked back down at the board. Something was off. His queen was cornered, his rook blocked, his knight pinned down. He leaned in, squinting. "Wait, hold on," he mumbled. Alara didn't move, didn't fidget. She just waited. Sarah stepped closer, one hand on her mouth. The CFO, David Chun, leaned forward too. No one was checking their phones anymore. Even the servers paused as they walked by. Alara reached forward, moved her rook. Another quiet move. The kind that looked small until you realized everything behind it. "Check," she said. Softly, Richard's eyes widened. The room went dead quiet. But if Richard thought this was just a lucky break, he was about to learn just how deep Alara's game really went. Richard stared at the board like it had betrayed him. His fingers hovered over his bishop, then his knight, then back again, like he was trying to force a future that didn't exist. He chuckled under his breath, but there was no humor in it anymore. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. Alara sat still, hands folded in her lap. She wasn't gloating, no smirk, no expression at all, just watching like she had nothing to prove. Because she didn't. Richard cleared his throat. "All right," he said louder. "You've got some moves. Maybe I underestimated you." A few of the executives chuckled politely, unsure of which side of the joke they were on. "But let's be real," Richard continued, forcing a grin. "One check doesn't mean much. This game is far from over." Alara nodded slightly. "Of course, take your time." He moved a pawn to block. It was clumsy, too reactive. Allura's eyes flicked. Over the board, her hands moved again. "You should have castled," she said simply. Another piece snapped into place. David Chun raised an eyebrow. "He's getting boxed in." Richard shot him a quick look. "It's just a warm-up," but the room wasn't laughing anymore. They were watching. Sarah stepped closer. "She's building a trap. Look at the center." Richard leaned forward, squinting again. He didn't want help, but he needed it. Alara spoke gently. "The board doesn't care who you are, Mr. Vance. It just reflects how you think." The sentence hit like a jab. Not angry, not cruel, just honest. And that's when the joke started to feel like something else, something heavier, because everyone there knew what this really was. Richard didn't invite Alara to the table out of generosity. He did it to show off, to get a few laughs, maybe embarrass someone who couldn't push back. She was supposed to fumble, to shrink, to remind the room of how high they all sat and how far she was below. But she didn't shrink. She leaned in, and every move reminded them how wrong they were. Wait, Richard said, holding up a hand. "Let's pause for a second. Let's reset. Start fresh." Alara raised an eyebrow. "You want to start over?" He hesitated. "I mean, this was just for fun, right? Nobody's keeping score." Her voice was soft. "Only people losing say that." The line wasn't sharp. It wasn't even said with heat. But the room reacted like it had been slapped. Someone near the back muttered, "She's not playing with him. She's playing through him." Richard swallowed. "All right then," he snapped. "Let's go." Alara moved again. This time, her knight slipped into a position that pinned Richard's rook between her bishop and queen. Another gasp. "She's closing in," Sarah whispered. Richard's cheeks flushed. He looked up, eyes darting from face to face. These were his people, his lieutenants. He paid their salaries, controlled their futures. But at that moment, none of that power helped him. Because in chess, money doesn't move pieces, only skill does. And Alara had it. "I mean, let's be real," Richard said, trying to laugh it off. "She probably grew up playing this on porches somewhere, right?" Allura's jaw stiffened. A long silence followed. Then she spoke. "No, I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment over a barber shop in Little Rock. We didn't have a porch. We had a coffee table with a broken leg and a hand-me-down board, missing 2 pawns." She looked him in the eyes. "I replaced them with bottle caps. Still beat my brothers every week." That line wasn't just a clapback. It was a reminder. She didn't learn the game in comfort. She learned it in the gaps where people like Richard never had to live. And somehow in that gap, she built the kind of discipline you couldn't buy. Richard looked back at the board. He moved his queen to counter, but it was too late. His right side was exposed. Alara leaned forward. "Check again," she said. This time, no one spoke. But the more he tried to win, the more it became clear this wasn't just a game anymore. It was a mirror. And Richard hated what he saw in it. By the 7th move, something in the room had shifted. You could feel it. No more polite. Chuckles. No more side-eye smirks, just silence. Richard's back stiffened. His fingers tapped the edge of the table. He was used to control, to walking into any room and knowing it was his. But here, in front of this chessboard, Ilara had taken that from him without raising her voice or breaking a sweat. He tried to act casual, leaned back, took a sip of scotch. "Y'all act like she's Magnus Carlsen or something," he said, forcing a chuckle. "Let me breathe." Nobody laughed with him this time. Ilara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her next move, queen to g5, tightened the noose. His remaining knight was trapped, his rook pinned. His king sat in the open like a man with no friends left. "She's suffocating his defense," David muttered. Sarah nodded slowly. "She's not rushing. That's what makes it worse." Richard's eyes scanned the board like a man staring at a deadline he couldn't talk his way out of. He moved a pawn anything, just to stay alive. But the moment he let it go, Ilara's hand moved. She slid her rook to the corner. "Double threat," she said. "Check in too." Someone in the room actually said, "Damn," under their breath. Richard's jaw tensed. "Okay, now you're just showing off." Ilara looked up, unbothered. "You invited me to play. I'm playing." It wasn't arrogance. It was fact, and it left no space for ego. He gritted his teeth. "You trying to prove something?" She leaned back, folding her hands. "No, just tired of pretending I don't know how to win." Boom, the weight of that line. You could have heard it drop like thunder. Sarah turned to David, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't just playing the board. She was studying him the second he opened his mouth. Richard tried to recover. He moved his bishop. Ilara didn't even flinch. "I told you," she said softly. 3 moves. She reached out, calm as ever, and slid her queen forward. "Checkmate." Gasps. One of the assistants actually dropped their drink. The room froze completely still. All eyes on Richard. All eyes on Ilara. Richard stared at the board. His hand hovered, then dropped. He couldn't deny it. Couldn't fake his way out. Couldn't make a joke big enough to erase the fact that he'd just been outplayed by the very woman he thought he could mock. He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Ilara stood up. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate. She adjusted her apron. Then gently she began putting the pieces back in their places one by one, silently. Richard watched. Her hands, stunned into stillness. "You know," he mumbled finally, "this wasn't how it was supposed to go." Ilara looked at him, really looked at him. "I know," she said. "That's the problem." Not a threat, not a boast, just the truth. She turned to walk away. Her shoes whispered against the floor. "Wait," Sarah called after her. Ilara stopped. Sarah cleared her throat. That was impressive. Ilara gave her a small, warm nod. "Thank you." Richard looked down, then muttered, "Guess. You're more than just a maid." Ilara paused, turning her head slightly. "I always was," she said. "You just didn't see it." But the real checkmate wasn't the move. It was how Ilara walked away with her dignity intact while the room sat there trying to figure out how they'd missed the brilliance sitting right in front of them. Ilara left the room like she'd simply done her job. No victory lap, no smirk, no dramatic pause. Just quiet steps down the hallway and back to the kitchen. But the silence she left behind was louder than anything she could have said. Richard stayed seated at the board, still elbows on the table, his drink untouched. He stared at the chess pieces as if they'd betrayed him. Someone finally broke the silence. Sarah turned to the others. "You all saw that, right?" "That wasn't just a game," David nodded slowly. "He tried to use her." She didn't just win, she taught him something. Across the room, phones were lowered. Conversations came in hushed tones now, awkward and broken. The power dynamic had flipped without warning, and no one knew how to carry themselves. One of the younger executives, Mark, fresh out of business school, shook his head. I feel like I just watched a movie or something. Like that didn't feel real. Oh, it was real, Sarah said. You just weren't expecting the ending. Richard finally pushed back from the table. The chair made a hard scrape on the floor. He stood up, exhaling like the wind had been knocked out of him. No words, just the look of someone realizing too late that he wasn't the smartest person in the room. He looked around, met a few eyes, then dropped his gaze again. The guests began to scatter quietly. Conversations picked back up in low tones, but nothing sounded the same. The mood had cracked. People were watching him now, not because he was the boss, but because they didn't know what to make of what they just saw. In the kitchen, Alara washed a few glasses. Nothing fancy, no ceremony. She stood by the sink like she had for every event she ever worked. Only this time, something felt different, even if she never said a word. Sarah stepped in. Alara didn't look up right away, but she felt her presence. Hey, Sarah said gently. I hope that didn't make things harder for you. Alara glanced at her, drying her hands with a towel. You mean harder than being mocked in front of 30 people? Sarah looked down, embarrassed. Fair. Alara gave a small smile. Not bitter, just knowing. It's all right. I've been invisible in nicer rooms than that. Sarah stepped closer. I just want you to know. That was one of the most graceful things I've ever seen. You didn't just beat him. You carried yourself with more class than half the people in that room combined. Alara nodded. Thanks. Sarah hesitated, then asked, You ever think about going back to school? I mean, I used to, Alara said. But sometimes life doesn't give you that kind of space. And then one day you realize everything you had to give, you gave somewhere else. Sarah didn't have a response, just respect. Meanwhile, back in the living room, Richard stood alone by the fireplace. He poured himself another drink, but he didn't touch it. His mind wasn't on the scotch. He looked over at the chessboard, pieces now reset. Alara had done it without being asked. He hadn't said thank you. And now standing there, he realized he didn't just lose a game. He exposed something ugly. Not just to the room, but to himself. He couldn't laugh it off, couldn't spin it. Alara hadn't yelled, she hadn't called him out. She hadn't needed to. Her calm intelligence had done all the talking. He took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, Richard Vance felt small. But what lingered in the air wasn't just the memory of the loss. It was the question no one in that room could stop asking themselves. What else have we been blind to just because we never bothered to look closer? Sunday morning came with the smell of fresh coffee, eggs, and silence. The usual chit-chat over brunch gone. People sat around the long oak table, pushing food around their plates, stealing glances at Richard, who looked like he hadn't slept. Alara moved between the tables, refilling coffee, quiet as always. Same uniform, same steps. But everything felt different, like the room knew now. She didn't need to say a word to hold their attention. David broke the quiet. Hey Alara, you ever think of coaching chess? She looked up mid-pour. Not really, he chuckled. You should. I'd sign up in a heartbeat. Richard sat at the end of the table watching. He hadn't touched his plate. Alara, he said suddenly. She turned slightly, waiting. I owe you an apology, he said. His voice wasn't strong. It was low, heavy. What I did yesterday wasn't just a bad joke. It was disrespectful. I saw you working, and I thought I was being clever. I wasn't. Ilara said nothing, just listened. I thought bringing you into that game would make people laugh. I didn't expect you to, win. She offered softly. You didn't respect the board, and you didn't respect me. That's what hurt. Not the joke, not even the assumptions, just the fact that I was never meant to be taken seriously. The room held its breath. Richard swallowed hard. You're right. He stood up slowly. And I've got a lot to think about. I spent years convincing myself I see people clearly. Turns out I've been looking through some of them. Ilara gave a small nod. Seeing people clearly starts with looking without judgment. Richard looked like he wanted to say more, but didn't. No how. He just nodded and sat down. The table stayed quiet for a moment longer. Then gradually, conversation returned. Less forced now, softer, more human. After brunch, as the guests began packing up and staff prepared for departure, Sarah found Ilara in the hallway near the back stairs. I meant what I said yesterday. Sarah told her, you don't need to play for applause. You already earned something more valuable. Ilara raised an eyebrow. What's that? Respect. And not the cheap kind. The kind that changes how people move. Ilara smiled at that. Maybe, but respect is only worth something if it changes behavior. Sarah nodded. Then I hope yesterday sticks. Later, as Ilara finished loading towels into a linen cart, she felt someone approach behind her. It was Richard. He didn't say anything. Right away, just handed her a folded envelope. She opened it after he left the room. Inside was a handwritten note. You taught me more in 15 minutes than most consultants have in 15 months. You reminded me that power isn't in how loud you speak, but how well you listen. Thank you for playing the game and for winning it with grace. Underneath was a check. It had more zeros than she expected. She folded it back into the envelope, tucked it into her apron, and returned to her cart without a word. She'd already won. But Ilara's real victory wasn't on the board. It was walking away without needing validation, proving that some people play chess with pieces and others with patience, silence, and truth. The estate emptied out by the afternoon. SUVs rolled down the gravel driveway one after another. Laughter returned, but quieter. Luggage clicked across stone tiles, and the hum of idle conversation filled the gaps where silence had stretched only hours earlier. Ilara stayed behind to help close up. She wiped counters, double-checked guest rooms, folded throws in the sitting room. The same work, the same pace, but every now and then, someone stopped to thank her. Not out of habit, but because they meant. As she cleaned the chess table one last time, she paused just for a second. The board was reset, the pieces waiting, white and black equal, until someone makes the first move. She looked at the queen, the same piece she'd used to corner Richard's king, to undo every smug grin and careless insult. She didn't smile, didn't sigh. She just set the queen upright again, perfectly centered, then turned and walked away. Back. In Sedona, Richard sat alone in his office on Monday morning. He didn't tell the story at work, didn't brag, didn't spin it into a clever anecdote. He just sat at his desk, eyes drifting to the framed photo of his executive team, most of whom had been there watching. He opened his laptop, pulled up the company's HR records. After a long pause, he typed, "Create initiative, professional development program for support staff. Include tuition reimbursement." Then he opened another tab and searched local chess clubs in Phoenix. Not to win, just to learn. Ilara never told anyone what happened at the retreat. She didn't need to. The lesson wasn't in the story. It was in how she carried herself afterward. She still worked, still swept, folded, scrubbed, But the people around her saw her differently now. They didn't just nod in passing. They saw her. And maybe more important, they started seeing each other too. There's something about a chess game that reveals the truth. It strips everything down, takes away titles, takes away wealth, takes away assumptions. In the end, it's just two people thinking, reacting, planning. And that's the point, isn't it? Life isn't about how loud you speak or how expensive your suit is or how many people clap when you walk into a room. It's about how you move with discipline, with grace, with integrity. Ilara didn't need a degree on the wall to prove she was smart. She didn't need a spotlight to prove she mattered. All she needed was a moment. And when that moment came, she moved right past the noise, right through the disrespect and right into the kind of victory that doesn't need to be announced. So here's the question. How do you move when no one's watching? Because the game, it's already on. You just might not know who's sitting across from you yet. If this story made you pause even just for a second, then carry that with you. Look closer at the people you pass by. Ask yourself if you're really seeing them. And when it's your turn to make a move, do it with humility. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. And sometimes it comes from the quietest voice in the room.